In this video, I'll be talking about user experience mapping. This video has two parts. In part 1, I'll cover common user experience mapping approaches. In part 2, I'll explain user experience mapping processes and workflow. Part 1, user experience mapping approaches. There are many user experience mapping approaches available, and despite their differences, they share a few key similarities. First, they are usually a collaborative process that benefits from the input of multiple perspectives, designers, users, stakeholders, so on. Second, their purpose is to understand the experience of users in order to be able to identify opportunities and to inform the development of solutions. Beyond these two main similarities, there are many subtle variations and a few large differences. This diagram outlines some of the common user experience mapping approaches and how they're defined. On the top quadrants, we have concrete, which are well-defined problems and relate to the physical. On the bottom quadrants is abstract, which are not well-defined problems and relate to the conceptual. On the right quadrants is broad scope, which relates to non-specific problems or contexts, and to gain a holistic understanding and a macro view of something. On the left quadrant is narrow, which relates to very specific problems and context to gain an isolated understanding and micro view. We also have on the top solution dependent, which is related to a specific solution or a specific problem or product. And then down the bottom, we have solution independent, which is unrelated to a specific solution or product. Because different user experience mapping approaches exist for different problems, it's important to understand the problem and context that you're dealing with before you go ahead and choose a user experience mapping approach. Different ones will be effective or ineffective for different problems and contexts. In the next few slides, I will go over some of the more commonly used approaches. Let's begin with the simple, very common, and much loved persona. Personas are narrative descriptions of a type of user, which often represent a typical or target user. Personas are created using data of real people to ensure that they represent the characteristics of a real user group. This data is usually in the form of conversations or observations with people. It is typical with a design problem to use multiple personas so that we represent and consider multiple user experiences. We can group the varied experience of multiple people into different buckets, which are formed into a single persona. A variety of different content can make up a persona, and it can be presented in different ways. But importantly, this information is most effective when presented in an easy to understand, uncomplicated, and accessible format. Personas are essential for a number of mapping approaches that we use as designers. They often form the starting point or basis for the content that goes into the different maps that we create. As for the information that we typically include on personas, it can start at a high level or macro level and then go down to more micro or specific level. A short bio and a scenario explains who the user is and what the scope of the problem is. General information, such as demographics, vocation, education, and lifestyle, provide some specifics about different spheres of life. Attributes can detail a number of factors important to the problem being addressed, such as personality, preferences towards different brands and products, interests, hobbies, types of traits that they have, and psychographics, which describe values, goals, needs, likes and dislikes, and so on. A persona doesn't need to include all possible categories. It is best to focus on information relevant to the problem and the area that you're designing for. Next up, empathy maps. Empathy maps are closely related to a persona. They are a tool used to document and articulate knowledge or information about a particular type of user. Just like personas, these are informed by research and user engagement. They are comprised of 4 different quadrants: what the user thinks, does, feels, and says. Says includes things that the user has said or is likely to say, which can include quotes or keywords. Thinks relates to psychological aspects, such as a user's motivations, their goals, needs, and desires. Does relates to the actions or the specific behaviors that a user exhibits. Feels relates to emotions and feelings. We can think of an empathy map as similar to a brainstorm about a user, and we can use the content to actually construct personas, so they can be a useful tool at the very beginning when you're trying to understand a general person and turn it into a persona. Empathy maps are also used for synthesizing user needs and identifying opportunities. They are useful for developing insights about a specific problem related to a user. Because of their simple format, they are easy to start pulling together, and you usually don't need much information to start. Alright, so now we're moving into the more elaborate mapping approaches. These go beyond just understanding the user and start to conceptualize and represent an experience over time. An experience map is a holistic visualization of an entire experience that a person goes through. Experience maps tend to be created in the context of a broad activity, which could be something like commuting to work, independent of a particular mode of transport. Because of this breadth, they can explore the thinking process of the experiences or the thoughts about commuting to work, rather than specifics of commuting to work on a bus or on a bike. A key concern of experience maps is human behavior. They focus on the different goals and objectives of a person, but of course, they can include a lot more information, which consider a range of factors in a person's experience. More about this on the next slide. An important characteristic about an experience map is that they are solution agnostic. This means that it does not assume that a person is a user or needs to be a user of a specific product or service. They can explore very broad activity without a specific product or service at the center. In terms of the actual content that goes into an experience map, it can vary a lot, which means they are quite freeform and adaptable. They vary in scope depending on the context or the problem being explored. This could be a specific scenario, a day in the life, from morning all the way through to evening, or it could be much longer than just a single day. Because of this varied scope, the information included on these also varies. Experience maps can incorporate the thoughts of a user, their actions or behaviors, their goals at different points, things that motivate them at different stages, different forces that are acting on them or their decision making, and of course, pain points in the experience. Each of these are placed on rows and are mapped out chronologically to represent a typical, continuous phenomenal experience over time. This information is usually from an individual persona's point of view. So we can see this on the example here. We have a single persona at the top, and then this is the representation of their experience. It is possible to include multiple personas on a single experience map, but you must make a clear delineation between their information so that they can be compared. I mentioned before that experience maps are solution agnostic. Despite this, they can include different interactions with products and services, although they're not typically the focus in terms of actually what we use them for. What they are useful for is exploring very large or potential problems and identifying opportunities in these broad contexts or scenarios. They are used for understanding general behavior when you don't have a product in mind. They are used for understanding various perspectives using different personas, and they're great for identifying pain points or problems in broad contexts. And they help to identify opportunities for innovation. Closely related to experience maps are journey maps. These are a very focused type of visualization of a specific process that a person goes through during an interaction or an experience. They are usually focused around a goal and the achievement of that goal. Journey maps are from an individual user's point of view, but unlike an experience map, these tend to be for a specific product or service. Because of this, they assume that the person is a customer or a user of that product or service, and it is really a central feature to the journey map. Journey maps include insights into the motivations and attitudes of a user over time, and the goal is to understand a customer's needs or a user's needs and what the pain points are so that we can eventually address them and improve the experience. The content of a journey map, like an experience map, is based around a chronological timeline that maps a single user's goals, actions, thoughts, and emotions. This is often in a narrative format with various phases. These 3 phases I have here are not necessarily prescriptive, but they can be a good place to start. The initial phase is where a user might become aware of a product or service. This might be through advertisement, another person, or just an incidental discovery. The decision phase is where the user acquires or selects the product or service. This phase can detail the trigger point, which is what made them select the product. The use phase is where the user begins using the product and continues to use the product. This might include information on single use cases, renewal of use, and even advocating for the product's use to others. Various information can be included on rows of the journey map. At a very simple level, just the touch points could be marked, or rows can be added to detail specific actions, goals, emotional response, pain points, perception, satisfaction, opportunities, and so on. There's really no limit here. It's just a matter of understanding what the important aspects of the experience are and how they relate to the specific interaction that you're exploring. We use journey maps to understand an overall experience that a user has with a specific product or service, and they're effective at breaking down this full interaction experience. It is possible to identify where there might be inefficiencies in a product or service offering and its life cycle. You can identify very specific pain points and how to address them or how to avoid them, and then this information can inform design decisions based on positive or negative experiences that occur over time. These are important points to be able to improve user-product relationships and satisfaction. Next up, service blueprints. Service blueprints are applicable later in the design stage than experience and journey maps, usually once you've had a good idea of the product and service offering. They visualize how a product or service is experienced over time by a user and in real time. They are effective for showing different relationships among the various components and processes that occur within an experience. This can be the relationships between a physical interaction that a user has with a product, and then also the things that are happening behind the scenes. Service blueprints work under the assumption that components and processes are tied to specific touchpoints across a service offering or product interaction. They're also specific to a product or service, so there needs to be a product or service at the heart of them. Service blueprints also assume that the person is a user because they represent the interaction between the product and the user. So you might consider using a service blueprint after a journey map to drill into a solution in more depth and at a bit more granularity. In terms of the content of a service blueprint, they focus on visualizing some specific interactions as part of an episode at a high level of detail. What makes up the service blueprint is user and product events and interactions that occur over time. These can be specific actions that a user might take, the objects they're interacting with, the processes involved, and the outcomes that happen as a result of interactions. These interactions and processes are represented at different levels, and this is really one of the most effective aspects of a service blueprint. They represent interactions that are salient to the user and those that are happening behind the scenes. These are classified as on or off-stage interactions, or also known as front stage or backstage interactions. If you look at the example here, we can see in the top half, the blue-gray rows show front stage interactions, which are what the user experiences. These are likely to be the interactions with technology, products, and other people that the user is directly experiencing. Backstage interactions, the yellow-orange rows, are processes that are invisible to the user, but they're happening behind the scenes. They're instrumental for the product or service to function, and they typically are supporting the on-stage experience. An example of this is when you're using an app. An on-stage interaction is you pressing the buttons and seeing what's happening as a result. And the off-stage interactions might be all the things like connections to a server or accessing information, communicating to another person, and so on, which you don't see. The primary use of service blueprints is to visualize complex product or service scenarios with the aim of improving the delivery of an experience. They enable us to see pain points and complexities that might happen and provide a format for ironing those out. Because of their detail, they allow great understanding of interactions in a multi-omni-channel experience with vast interactions among several components. Inefficiencies can also be identified to address poor performing aspects of a service and encourage optimization. This also includes isolating unintentional experiences. Alright, that gives you an idea of a couple of common user experience mapping approaches that we can use to understand users and their interactions. In part 2 of this video, I'll talk about mapping processes and workflows and important considerations when mapping experiences. The first thing that we need to consider when starting out on a mapping activity is that they are user-centered. Before you engage in any mapping, it's important that you've identified who the users are and tried to understand them. This can be done at a couple of different levels. We can map specific users, which involves capturing multiple different user types. This could be actual or potential types of users that are relevant. Or you could go for a generic user, which is a single user that has very generic characteristics or very common characteristics. The approach you take comes down to how complex the mapping activity is and what scope you want to achieve. The reason that it's important to approach mapping as user-centered is that, well, the user is at the center of all of these mapping approaches. As you can see in the examples, it's typical for many maps to include a persona as part of them so that there's always a reference to the user. Without this user information, any information on a map would be based on assumption, which is not what they're really about. To avoid assumptions as much as possible, it's best to actively engage with users through observations, interviews, surveys, and various other tools. It's also important that you're weighing up how suitable the types of information that you're gathering is to the mapping approach used. For example, if you want to know about physical interaction and emotion, will a survey be appropriate? Probably not. If you want to know about specific preferences, then a survey is probably better than observations. So choose your data gathering approach to fit the purpose. Once you have this background on a user, then you can start creating the map. The best way to do this is to start analog. Analog is very fast and fluid. Using a pen and paper, you can get ideas down quickly. Using post-it notes is a great option because you can move ideas around. They're not set in place like they are on a large format sheet of paper. You also want to have enough space to be able to work fast, but also quite fast. The aim is to get through this initial stage quite quickly so that you can start to reduce and refine. Once you've got a handle on the topic and flesh things out in analog, it can be time to move into digital representation. This enables you to clean up the analog work. When the ideas are refined, you can spend some time to create a concise and easy to understand presentation of the experience. But don't move to digital too early, as it can be a big time sink if you have to go back and change something. There's a couple of tools that we can use for creating a map once we get through that initial analog stage. Illustrator is probably my preference for final presentation because it's adaptable and customizable. Online applications, particularly Miro, are also fantastic. They have great presentation templates available, and they're excellent for collaboration. Alright, that's the end of this video. Hopefully it has given you a really good idea of some different user experience mapping approaches that you can use in the design process.